What happens when small men with loud mouths pick the wrong woman to humiliate? It was a Tuesday morning in Clarksville, Tennessee. The kind of morning where the air still carries the chill of the night before and the sun looks like it can't quite decide whether to show up or not. The bus stop on Maple Ridge Road sat quiet at 7:42 a.m. Just a concrete bench, a rusted green pole, and a schedule nobody really trusted anymore. Most people at that stop were minding their own business. A young mother held a sleeping toddler against her chest. A teenager in earbuds stared at his sneakers. A man in a postal uniform checked his watch every 30 seconds. And then there was Dorothy Mae Simmons. She was 71 years old, small in frame, but straight in posture, wearing a pale blue church coat she'd owned for over 2 decades and a pair of sensible black shoes that had walked more miles than most people could imagine. Her handbag sat neatly on her lap. A folded newspaper rested beside her on the bench. She had a doctor's appointment at 9 a.m., and she had arrived early, the way she always did, because that was simply how she was raised. Dorothy wasn't looking for trouble. She never did. She had lived 71 years learning how to be invisible in spaces that didn't want her, how to smile through things that deserved tears, how to hold herself with dignity even when the world was determined to strip it away. She had done it her whole life. But this morning, dignity was going to be tested in a way she hadn't seen in a long time. It started with 2 men. They pulled up to the bus stop in a beat-up white pickup truck, windows down, country music cranked loud enough to rattle the bench. The driver cut the engine and both of them climbed out, not because their bus had arrived, but because they had time to kill and apparently nothing better to do with it. The first one was tall, heavy-set, with a red baseball cap and a sunburn that went halfway up his neck. His name, as people would later learn, was Gary Pruitt. The second was shorter, wiry, with a smirk already built into his face before he even opened his mouth. People at the stop later described him simply as the one who started it. They sat down on the far end of the bench, close, too close, deliberately close. Gary glanced over at Dorothy and then looked away. That should have been the end of it. But the shorter one, the one with the smirk, he leaned in toward his friend and said something under his breath. Gary laughed. Then the shorter one laughed louder, and this time he wasn't whispering anymore. "You know they got a special bus for you people," he said, not looking at Dorothy directly at first, just speaking into the air like the cruelty was casual, like it was just conversation. Runs about 40 years late. A few people at the stop shifted. The young mother tightened her arms around her sleeping child. The teenager pulled out one earbud. Dorothy didn't move. She didn't look up. She kept her hands folded over her handbag, and her eyes on the middle distance, the way you do when you've decided not to give something the power of your attention. But the shorter man wasn't done. He never was. "Hey, I'm talking to you." He leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, looking directly at her. "What's wrong, you deaf two? Old and deaf must be rough." Gary snorted again. The postal worker looked at his shoes. The young mother bit her lip. Dorothy finally turned her head and looked at the man. Just looked at him, calm and steady. The way a person looks at something they've already decided doesn't deserve their anger, but does deserve their clarity. "I heard you just fine," she said quietly. "I just chose not to respond to rudeness." That was the wrong answer for a man like him. Not because it was aggressive or confrontational, but because it was dignified. And dignity in someone they've already decided doesn't deserve it, that makes certain kinds of people angrier than any insult ever could. He stood up. "Oh, she's got something to say," he announced to nobody in particular, spreading his arms out like he was performing. "Lady, do you even know where you are? This isn't your neighborhood. Why don't you take your little newspaper and your little church coat and find somewhere else to sit?" Dorothy looked at him for one long moment. Then she looked back at the road and said nothing. "You hear me?" He pushed. "Move." And that was the moment everything shifted, because that was the moment a voice came from across the street. It wasn't a loud voice. That was the first thing people noticed. It didn't need to be. Dorothy. Just one word. Her name. said the way you say the name of someone you have loved for 53 years. Everyone at the bus stop turned. Across Maple Ridge Road, coming from the direction of the small hardware store on the corner, was an old man. He was 74 years old, slightly built, moving slowly but deliberately with a wooden cane in his right hand. He wore a Veterans of Foreign Wars cap, dark green with gold lettering, pulled low over silver hair. His shirt was pressed. His trousers had a crease down the front. His shoes were the kind of clean that takes effort. His name was Corporal James Earl Simmons, United States Army, retired. 74th Infantry, 2 tours in Vietnam, a man who had watched boys younger than his own son die in rice paddies 10,000 miles from home, who had carried wounded soldiers on his back through jungle so thick you couldn't see 3 feet ahead of you, who had come home to a country that didn't want to talk about what he'd done or where he'd been. He had simply gone to the hardware store to pick up a hinge for the cabinet door in their kitchen. He had been gone 22 minutes. He crossed the road without rushing. His cane touched the pavement with a steady rhythm. His eyes were fixed on the 2 men standing over his wife. The shorter man watched him come and smiled. He was not concerned. He saw a slow-moving old man in a veteran's cap, and he was not concerned at all. That was his first mistake. James walked up to the bench. He didn't look at his wife yet. He kept his gaze on the shorter man, calm and level, the way a person looks when they have already done the arithmetic and they know exactly how this ends. "Were you speaking to my wife?" James asked. Not an accusation, just a question. Clean and direct. The shorter man tilted his chin up. "Yeah, I was. Telling her she's in the wrong place. Same goes for you, old-timer. Why don't you two?" "What is your name?" James said. That stopped the man. Not because he was afraid, just because it was unexpected. Nobody asked for names at the beginning of a confrontation. That was not how this was supposed to go. "My name?" the shorter man repeated. "Yes, your name." James's voice didn't waver. "I like to know who I'm speaking to." Gary took a small step back. He couldn't explain it exactly, but something about the old man's stillness made the air feel different, like the temperature had dropped 2 degrees in a quiet, invisible way. "Kyle," the shorter man said. Then, catching himself being pulled along, he straightened back up. "What's it matter to you?" James nodded slowly like he was filing the information away. "Kyle," he repeated. "My name is James Simmons. That is my wife of 53 years. She is sitting at a public bus stop on a public bench bothering nobody, and you are standing over her using language I will not repeat." He tilted his head slightly. "I need you to step back." Kyle let out a short laugh. "Or what? You gonna hit me with your cane, old man?" A long silence. The young mother had stopped, pretending not to watch. The teenager had both earbuds out now. The postal worker had put his watch away. James looked at Kyle for a long moment without blinking. Then he said very quietly, "I have done things in my life that I do not talk about at bus stops. So I am asking you one time respectfully to step back from my wife." Something in his voice made the sentence land differently than it should have for a man his age, in his condition standing there with a wooden cane. Kyle heard it. Gary definitely heard it. They couldn't have explained what they heard exactly, just that the words weren't delivered with bravado or bluster. They were delivered like a fact, like a weather report. Calm and certain. Gary put his hand on Kyle's arm. "Come on," he muttered. "Let's go." Kyle shrugged it off. He wasn't ready to back down. Not in front of the people at the bus stop, not in front of this old man and his church coat wife. "You don't scare me," he said, but his voice had gone up just slightly at the end, just enough. James reached into his shirt pocket. Everyone braced. He pulled out a business card. He held it out toward Kyle. Kyle blinked and took it, confused. He read it. His expression flickered. He read it again. The card was simple. It had James's name. Below that it read, Corporal, United States Army, retired, 74th Infantry Division. Below that a phone number, and below that the name of a law firm. Holloway and Associates, Veteran Civil Rights Legal Counsel. James let the man look at it for a full 5 seconds. That is my attorney's number, James said. He has handled 7 cases in this county in the last 4 years. He wins all of them. He paused. What you said to my wife this morning was recorded. Kyle's eyes shot up. What? James tilted his head toward the pole above the bus stop bench. A small city-mounted security camera sat at the top, its red indicator light blinking steadily. It had been there for 8 months. Kyle looked at the camera, then back at James, then at the camera again. I served 2 tours so that my wife could sit on a public bench without being spoken to like she is less than a person, James said. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. Whether or not you agree with that, the law does, and so does that camera. Gary grabbed Kyle by the shoulder this time and didn't let go. Kyle, let's go. Right now. Kyle opened his mouth, closed it, and then for the first time since they'd pulled up, had nothing to say. They walked back to the truck. Not fast, not slow, but they walked back. The door slammed. The engine turned over. The truck pulled out and disappeared around the corner of Maple Ridge Road. The bus stop held its breath for a moment. Then the postal worker began to clap. Slow at first, then steady, and then the teenager joined, and then the young mother, shifting, her sleeping child to one arm so she could clap with the other. James didn't acknowledge the applause. He turned to Dorothy, tucked his cane under his left arm, and sat down beside her on the bench. He looked at her face for a moment, checking on her the way he had been checking on her for 53 years. The same quiet inventory, eyes, shoulders, hands. You all right? He asked. Dorothy smoothed the front of her coat. I'm fine, she said. Then, after a pause, your cabinet hinge. James patted his jacket pocket. Got it. She gave a small nod. Then she unfolded her newspaper. He sat beside her. They waited for the bus, but the story didn't end at the bus stop. It rarely does. The city's transit authority reviewed the security footage that afternoon after 3 separate witnesses submitted written complaints about the incident. By evening, the footage had been passed to the Clarksville Police Department. By the next morning, it had been shared online by a local news account covering city council matters. With no sensationalism, just 3 lines of text and the raw 40-second clip from the camera above the bench. By noon, it had been viewed over 2 million times. The comments flooded in. Veterans from across the country, men and women who had worn the uniform across 6 decades of American military history, left messages. Some were just 2 words, "We see you." Some were longer, paragraphs from people who said they had never posted a comment on anything in their lives but felt they had to this time. The clip showed everything. It showed Kyle standing over Dorothy. It showed the way he leaned in. It showed the moment James crossed the road, unhurried, deliberate. It showed him handing over the card. It showed Kyle's face when he looked at the camera. It showed the applause. And it showed the ending. The 2 of them, sitting side by side on the bench, she with her newspaper, he with his hand resting gently on top of hers, waiting for a bus that ran 4 minutes late. That image, that one still frame someone pulled from the footage and posted, became the one that circulated the furthest. An old man in a VFW cap and an old woman in a pale blue church coat, hands overlapping on the bench, quiet and unshaken. Kyle Pruitt and Gary Dunham, as their names were eventually confirmed by the police report, were identified through the truck's license plate within 12 hours of the footage going public. Both were questioned by Clarksville PD. Both issued statements through a local representative claiming they had been having a bad morning and that things had gotten out of hand. The Clarksville Civil Rights Commission opened a review within 48 hours. James Simmons did not hold a press conference. He did not do interviews. A reporter from the local paper knocked on the door of their home on Whitfield Street, a small, neat house with a vegetable garden in the back and a flag displayed properly in the front window, and James answered in his undershirt and asked politely if the reporter could come back at a better time. Dorothy made the reporter a cup of coffee while James changed his shirt. Then they sat at the kitchen table and James gave the only public comment he would make about the entire incident. I didn't do anything extraordinary, he said, folding his hands on the table. I went and got my wife, that's all. The reporter wrote it down and looked up. "But sir, those two men, the way you handled that." James shook his head. "I talked to them, same as I'd talk to anybody." He paused. "My wife has more courage in that church coat than most people twice her size." She sat there without flinching. She kept her dignity. That's not something she learned from me. She's always had it. Dorothy, from the kitchen, said nothing, but she smiled at the cabinet door where the new hinge James had installed that afternoon was working perfectly. 3 weeks later, James Simmons received a letter from the VFW National Headquarters in Kansas City. They had seen the footage. They had read the report. They wanted to recognize him at their annual national gathering the following spring. He read the letter twice. Then he set it on the kitchen counter and went back to his vegetable garden. Dorothy found it later and taped it to the refrigerator. She didn't tell him she'd done it. He saw it the next morning when he went for his orange juice and stood there, for a moment, reading it again. Then he poured his juice, sat down at the kitchen table and opened the newspaper. But here is what the cameras didn't capture, what the viral clip didn't show, what the news reports and the comments and the 2 million views never quite got to. It didn't show the night James came home from his second tour, 1971, thin as wire and quiet as a closed door. And Dorothy met him on the porch of her mother's house in Georgia and didn't say a word, just put her hand in his and stood there with him in the dark until he was ready to come inside. It didn't show the years he woke up at 3 a.m., with his jaw clenched and his hands shaking, and she would sit up beside him without complaint and make him a cup of tea and stay awake until the sky started going gray. It didn't show her working double shifts at the hospital laundry for 6 years while he finished school on the GI Bill, or him walking her to the bus stop every single morning for the past 14 years because his hip hurt, and she always told him he didn't have to, and he always came anyway. It didn't show 53 years of choosing each other. Every ordinary morning, every hard night, every quiet Tuesday when nothing remarkable happened and everything good was just there, steady and unhurried, like the rhythm of a cane on pavement crossing a road to get to the person who needed you. What happened at a bus stop on Maple Ridge Road on a Tuesday morning was not just about 2 rude men being put in their place. It was about what the men underestimated. They saw an old woman in a church coat and decided she was alone. She was never alone. They saw an old man with a cane and decided he was helpless. He had carried soldiers out of jungles under fire. A bus stop in Clarksville, Tennessee was not going to be a problem. They spoke to Dorothy Simmons like she was nothing, and they did not know that she had spent 53 years being the foundation of a man who served this country before most people in that truck had been born. They did not know that her patience and her dignity and the way she held herself on that bench, even while being insulted, was not weakness. It was the kind of strength you only develop after decades of deciding that you refuse to let the small cruelties of the world make you smaller. They didn't know any of that. They found out. The last time anyone saw Kyle Pruitt publicly comment on the incident, he was asked by a reporter outside a gas station if he had anything to say. He looked at the camera for a long moment, then he said, "I didn't know," and walked away. That's the thing about assumptions. They don't warn you before they collapse. They don't give you a preview of what you're walking into. They just let you keep going, confident and careless, until the moment the ground disappears, and you realize you never knew as much as you thought you did. James Simmons didn't need anyone to know his name, his service, his rank, his record. He just needed his wife to know he was there. And she did. She always did. Some love stories are written in grand gestures and dramatic moments, and some are written in the quiet, steady rhythm of a man who crosses a road every morning to sit beside the woman he chose more than half a century ago. That rhythm doesn't stop because 2 strangers decide one Tuesday morning that she doesn't matter. She always mattered. She always will. And now the whole world knows it. If this story moved you, share it. Because there are men like James Simmons who came home from wars nobody wanted to talk about and built lives nobody knew to honor. And there are women like Dorothy who have carried more than they were ever given credit for, quietly, in pale blue church coats, on benches and in hospital laundries and at kitchen tables for decades. They are not waiting for recognition. They never were. But they deserve it anyway. Pass it on.